They ruled the galaxy in fear, until humans woke. The Keth Empire did not conquer worlds, they bought them. That was the difference between the Keth and every other power in the known galaxy, and the Keth were very proud of that difference. They did not burn colonies. They did not march armies through cities. They arrived with contracts, with lawyers, with economists who could explain in precise and friendly language exactly why signing was better than the alternative. The alternative was always left vague. That was intentional. In 300 years of expansion, the Keth had absorbed 61 species into their economic framework. 61 species who now produced goods that flowed upward, paid fees that compounded annually, and existed inside a system so thoroughly designed that resistance felt not like fighting an army, but like arguing with mathematics. You could not shoot a compound interest rate. You could not bomb a debt structure. The Keth had understood this before anyone else did, and they had built an empire on that understanding, and it worked perfectly. Until the humans arrived and started asking questions. The first human the Keth ever officially dealt with was not a soldier or a diplomat. He was an accountant named Bram, which the Keth translator rendered as a sound roughly equivalent to a short, blunt object, which they privately found appropriate. Bram arrived on Keth Central Station on a mid-cycle shift and requested access to the public contract registry. The registry was technically public. It had always been technically public. No species had ever actually requested access to it before, because no species had ever had reason to believe they could understand it. The contracts were written in Keth legal language, which had 17 grammatical tenses specific to financial obligation, and which had been deliberately made as complex as possible over 2 centuries of careful legal evolution. The registry clerk gave Bram access because she had no reason not to. 3 weeks later, Bram submitted a 200-page analysis of the Keth contract structure to the Human Coordination Council. The analysis was written in plain language. It included a section called How It Works, a section called Why It Is Designed This Way, and a section called What Can Be Done About It. The third section was the longest. The Keth did not know about the analysis for another 4 months. By the time their intelligence office flagged it, copies had been distributed to representatives of 23 species currently operating under Keth contracts. The head of Keth intelligence, a composed and precise being named Save, read the report summary and then read it again. Then she called her deputy and asked how a single human with a mathematics background had accessed 40 years of proprietary financial data through a public registry. Her deputy said the registry was technically public. Save said she understood that. Her deputy said the human had simply read it. Save said she understood that too. What she wanted to know was why no one had ever done it before. Her deputy was quiet for a moment. Then he said that most species under Keth contracts did not have the educational infrastructure to produce individuals capable of reading that kind of document. The Keth educational assistance programs offered to tributary species did not include advanced economics. Save sat with this information. She said, "Where did the humans learn advanced economics?" Her deputy said from themselves. Apparently they had several centuries of their own economic history to draw from, including multiple periods of catastrophic financial collapse that they had studied extensively and written about in considerable detail. Save asked if the humans had ever had a functional equivalent of the Keth contract system applied to them. Her deputy checked his records. He said yes, actually, several times. Different human groups had applied variations of exploitative debt structures to other human groups throughout their history. He said the humans called it by several names. The most common translation was colonialism. Save put down the report. She said they recognized it. Her deputy said it appeared so. Save stood and walked to her viewport and looked out at the station's internal ring. where ships from 61 species moved in the careful choreography of a system that had taken 3 centuries to build. She said, "How many copies of this analysis are currently in circulation?" Her deputy said the number as of that morning was approximately 4,000, across 19 species, and that a human named Ava, described in the intelligence file as a coordinator of some kind, had begun scheduling meetings with representatives of several tributary species to discuss the findings. Save asked what the meetings were about. Her deputy said the early reports suggested the humans were explaining the analysis to species that could not read it themselves, walking them through it, answering questions, offering to help draft counter-proposals. Save asked if they were charging for this service. Her deputy checked. He said no. Save closed her eyes for a moment. In 300 years of empire, no one had ever simply helped another species understand their own contract without extracting something in return. It was not how the galaxy worked. It was not how anything worked. She asked how many humans were currently operating in Keth-adjacent space. The number was larger than she expected. They had been arriving quietly over the past 2 years, ship by ship, setting up small trade posts, building relationships with local species, learning languages. The intelligence file described their expansion pattern as less like a military advance and more like water finding its way through stone. No single point of pressure, just presence everywhere gradually. She asked her deputy what he recommended. He said that legally the humans had done nothing wrong. They had accessed a public registry. They had shared information. They had held voluntary meetings with willing participants. Save said she was not asking about legality. She was asking what he recommended. He was quiet for a longer time. Then he said he thought they should try to understand what the humans wanted before deciding anything else. Save thought about that. She thought about 61 species in a system so carefully designed that none of them had ever found the edge of it. She thought about a man named Bram with a mathematics background who had walked up to a public registry and simply read it. She thought about the section of the analysis called "What Can Be Done About It," which she had not yet read in full but which was apparently very long. She told her deputy to arrange a meeting with the human coordinator. Whatever came next, she wanted to look at it directly. The galaxy had given the Keth 300 years of quiet compliance. It had apparently not occurred to anyone involved in building that system that somewhere out in the unmapped dark, a species was evolving that had already lived through this once from the other side. They had taken notes. Save met Ava in a neutral room on a mid-tier station that belonged to neither side. The room had been chosen by the Keth because it had no recording equipment, and because it was on a station where 3 different species operated overlapping administrative authority, which meant anything said there existed in a legal gray zone that suited the Keth preference for conversations that had not technically happened. Ava arrived with 2 people. One was Bram, who turned out to be shorter than Save had imagined and who sat down immediately and opened a battered document case and began organizing papers as though he was preparing for a tax audit. The other was a quiet woman named Petra who said nothing during the entire meeting and watched everything, which Save found more interesting than anything Bram said. Save opened by asking what the humans wanted. Ava said that was a broad question and she wanted to make sure she understood the scope of it. Did Save mean what the humans wanted from this meeting, or what they wanted generally? Save said generally. Ava said that generally the humans wanted the species currently operating under Keth contracts to understand what those contracts actually said. Save said the contracts were publicly available and written in a registered legal language. Ava said yes, in a language that required 17 years of specialized education to read fluently, and that the Keth educational assistance programs offered to tributary species did not include that education, which she said without any particular heat, The way someone states a fact they found interesting rather than an accusation they were making. Save said legal complexity was not the same as deception. Ava said she agreed completely. She said she was not there to argue about the legality. She said the contracts were legal. She said the entire system was legal. She said Bram's analysis did not contain a single claim that any Keth action had violated any law. Save asked then what the analysis was for. Ava said it was so that the species who had signed the contracts could make informed decisions going forward. There was a silence. Save said that most of those species had renewal clauses coming up within the next decade, and that renegotiation was always possible within the existing framework. Ava said yes, and that Bram had prepared some sample counterproposals for 3 of the species most severely affected, if Save was interested in seeing what informed renegotiation might look like. Bram placed 3 documents on the table without being asked. Save did not touch them. She looked at them. They were dense with numbers, neatly formatted, with margin notes in a smaller script. She asked who had helped draft them. Ava said the species themselves, with human guidance. She said the Gorathi representatives had been particularly sharp once they understood the compound fee structure. She said one elder Gorathi woman had looked at the numbers for about 4 minutes and then said a word in her own language that the translator rendered as something close to obvious. Save looked at the documents for a long time. She said, "You understand that if we accept renegotiation on favorable terms, it sets a precedent across all 61 contracts." Ava said she understood that. Save said the economic impact would be substantial. Ava said she imagined it would. Save said, "And if we refuse?" Ava said that was entirely the Keth's decision. She said that the analysis had already been distributed and that the meetings with tributary species would continue regardless of what the Keth decided. She said she was not there to threaten. She said that she was there because Save had asked for a meeting, and because Ava believed that people who were willing to sit in a room together were worth talking to. She said this in a tone that Save had no framework for. It was not the tone of someone negotiating. It was not the tone of someone threatening. It was the tone of someone who had decided on a course of action and was genuinely indifferent to whether the other party found it convenient. Save had negotiated with representatives of 40 species over her career. She knew every variant of pressure, every form of leverage, every shape that wanting something took when it sat across a table from you. This was different. This was someone who did not appear to need anything from her. The quiet woman, Petra, had still not said anything, but at this point she reached into her bag and placed a small device on the table. It was a portable display, the humankind, battered and scratched. She turned it on and slid it towards Save. On the screen was a list of names. Save read through it. They were the names of species, some she recognized, some she did not. She asked what the list was. Petra spoke for the first and only time in the meeting. She said it was the species that humans were currently in contact with who were not under Keth contracts, species in uncharted regions, species the Keth had surveyed and passed over, species that had not yet been found by anyone except humans. Save understood immediately. It was not a threat. It was information. It was Petra showing her the edges of the map that the Keth did not know existed yet, and doing it openly and not asking for anything in return for the information. It was the most unsettling thing that had happened in the meeting. Save picked up the 3 renegotiation documents from the table. She said she would have her legal team review them. Ava said that sounded reasonable. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Save walked back to her ship through the station's main corridor and thought about 61 contracts and a woman named Ava who had come to a meeting in a neutral room with no leverage and no weapons, and had somehow made the Keth Empire feel, for the first time in 3 centuries, like it was the smaller party in the room. She thought about the list of names on the battered screen. She thought about a species that had taken notes. She told her deputy when she got back to her ship to begin drafting a full assessment of human expansion patterns over the past 5 years. Not military, not political, everything. Trade posts, language studies, cultural exchanges, medical assistance, the things that did not show up in military intelligence because they did not look like threats. Her deputy asked what he was looking for. Save said she was not sure yet, but she thought that if you wanted to understand what the humans were building, you needed to look at everything they had touched and find the shape of it. She thought the shape was going to be very large. The Keth made their move 6 months later, and they made it quietly, which was the only way they knew how to move. They did not send a fleet, they sent a contract. It was a standard framework agreement, the kind the Keth used as a first step with new species. It offered trade access, infrastructure support, and a legal protection clause that sounded generous until you read the definitions section, which redefined protection in a way that made it functionally identical to oversight, which was functionally identical to control. The document was 400 pages. It had been drafted by the best legal minds in Keth employ, and it was, as always, technically correct in every clause. They sent it to the Human Coordination Council, with a cover letter describing it as an offer of partnership. The response came back in 11 days. It was also 400 pages. The Keth legal team spent a week reading it. At the end of the week, the senior legal advisor went to Save's office and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, which was unusual because she was not a person who paused before speaking. She said the humans had returned the contract with annotations. Save asked what kind of annotations. The advisor said every clause that the Keth had used in previous contracts to establish control had been identified, flagged, and rewritten. Not removed entirely, which would have been easy to dismiss. Rewritten into something that actually meant what the clause appeared to mean on the surface. The definitions section had been rewritten, so that protection meant protection. The infrastructure clauses had been modified so that infrastructure investment could not be used as a basis for claiming administrative rights. The legal protection clause had been amended to specify that legal protection applied equally in both directions. Save asked if the humans had consulted with any existing Keth legal staff. The advisor said no. She said the annotations showed familiarity with Keth legal language at a level that suggested extensive independent study. She said one annotation in the margin, next to a particularly complex clause about arbitration jurisdiction, simply said we have seen this before and drew a small arrow to a footnote that cited 4 separate examples from human legal history where equivalent language had been used and what the outcomes had been. Save read the annotated contract herself that evening. It was, in a way she found difficult to articulate, one of the most uncomfortable documents she had ever read. Not because it was hostile, it was not hostile at all. The tone throughout was cooperative, even friendly. Several of the human rewrites were genuinely better legal language than what the Keth had originally used, more precise and more fair. The marginal notes were not accusatory. They were informative. They explained, patiently and without apparent anger, why each flagged clause was problematic and what a reasonable alternative looked like. Reading it felt like being shown your own face in a mirror you had not known existed. The Keth held an internal council session to decide how to respond. The session lasted 3 days. The harder line members argued for withdrawing the offer entirely and pursuing a different approach. They said the humans were demonstrating that they could not be managed through standard frameworks, and that this made them a threat that needed to be addressed directly. Save asked what directly meant in this context. The harder line members said economic pressure, restricting human access to Keth-controlled trade routes, building alliances with species that the humans had not yet reached, and preemptively binding them into contracts before human influence could spread further. Save said the humans had a list. Everyone looked at her. She said the quiet human woman, Petra, had shown her a list of species currently in contact with humans who were not under Keth contracts. Species the Keth had surveyed and passed over. The list had been shared openly, without being asked for. She said she had spent considerable time thinking about why Petra had done that, and she believed now that she understood. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to look at what was already true. The humans were already there. In the unmapped regions, in the spaces between Keth trade routes, in the places that the Keth economic model had judged not worth the cost of entry. The humans had gone there anyway because they were not operating on an economic model. They were operating on something else entirely, something Save still did not have a clean word for. She said that the preemptive contract strategy would require reaching approximately 40 species before human relationships with those species deepened. She said the Keth could probably manage 20 of them in the time available. She said the other 20 would end up in the human network regardless. She said the question was not whether the humans were going to change the galaxy. She said that was already happening and the rate was accelerating. The question was what position the Keth wanted to occupy when the shape of the change became fully visible. The Harder Line members asked what position she was recommending. Save picked up the annotated contract. She said that someone had spent considerable effort making their agreement fairer, and that they had done it without being asked, and that the result was actually a better document. She said she thought the Keth should consider what it meant that their best-designed system for managing relationships had been improved by the first species to read it carefully. She said she thought they should sign the amended version. The council chamber was very quiet. One of the older council members, a being who had been part of the Keth expansion since its early years, asked if Save understood what precedent that set. Save said she did. She said if they signed a fair agreement with the humans, every tributary species would eventually hear about it and ask why their own agreements were different. The older council member said that was exactly what he was worried about. Save said she thought that was exactly the point. She said the humans were going to keep distributing that analysis. They were going to keep holding meetings. They were going to keep translating things into plain language and showing people what their own contracts said. She said you could not stop information from moving once it was moving, especially when the people moving it were not asking for payment and not asking for power, and seemed to genuinely believe they were just doing something that needed doing. She said the Keth had two options. They could spend the next 50 years fighting the tide, or they could be the first empire in 3 centuries to voluntarily become something different. She said the first option would probably work for a while. She said the second option was the only one that lasted. The vote was close, but it passed. Save signed the amended contract 3 days later in a small ceremony that the Keth did not announce publicly, in a room with Ava and Bram and the quiet woman Petra, who smiled when the document was signed and then went back to being quiet. Ava shook Save's hand afterward. It was a human gesture that Save had read about but not experienced. It was firmer than she expected. She asked Ava afterward why the humans had rewritten the contract instead of simply refusing it. Ava said refusing it would have solved nothing. She said the Keth would have sent another one. She said the only thing worth doing was making it into something that worked for everyone. Save said most species in this galaxy did not think that way. Ava said she knew. She said that was sort of the whole problem. Outside the station viewport, the traffic of 61 species moved in its familiar patterns, but something had shifted in the weight of it, some small invisible load redistributed, and Save thought that this was how large things always started, not with battles, with a document that someone had read carefully and handed back with notes. Word travels fast when it is something people have been waiting to hear. The signed agreement between the Keth and the Human Council was not announced officially, but within 4 months, Representatives of 9 tributary species had obtained copies of both the original contract and the amended version. They had placed them side by side. They had read the differences. Several of them had forwarded the comparison to other species without being asked, because that was what you did when you found out the floor you had been standing on had a trapdoor in it. The Gorathi were first to formally request renegotiation. Their representative was a woman named Dara, who arrived at Keth Central Station with a document case almost identical to Bram's, and who sat across from the Keth Trade Council and opened negotiations by placing the annotated human contract in the center of the table and saying nothing for a full minute while everyone looked at it. The Keth Trade Council renegotiated. It took 3 weeks and it was not comfortable, but they renegotiated. They had agreed to the principle when Save signed the human agreement, and a principle that applied in one direction had to apply in all of them, or it was not a principle. It was a preference. 7 more species began renegotiation processes within the following year. This was not what the hardline Keth faction had wanted. They watched the process with increasing agitation, and they pushed, internally, for a reversal. They said Save had made a miscalculation. They said one fair agreement had not bought peace or goodwill. It had bought a precedent that was now costing the Empire its structural advantage across 61 contracts simultaneously. Save did not argue with the math. The math was correct. The economic model was recalibrating, and the recalibration was expensive. She said the previous model had also been expensive. The cost had simply been paid by other people. The hardline faction did not accept this, and they began looking for leverage elsewhere. They found it in the Solhari. The Solhari were not under a Keth contract. They were a small trading species who operated in the spaces between larger powers, which meant they survived by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. They had been among the first species to develop a relationship with the humans. They had shared trade routes, exchanged crew members during long journeys, and participated in several of the human-facilitated meetings with Keth tributary species. The hardline faction decided that the Solhari were an accessible pressure point. They could not directly threaten the humans, but they could make the Solhari understand that their continued access to Keth-controlled trade infrastructure depended on their willingness to distance themselves from human networks. They sent an envoy. What they did not know was that the Solhari trader who received the envoy, a careful and quiet woman named Liz, had been flying routes in this region for 9 years. She had survived 9 years by being very good at reading what a conversation was actually about underneath what it appeared to be about. She had also, in the past 2 years, become close with several human crew members who had taught her, among other things, that writing things down was useful. She wrote everything the Keth envoy said down. She sent the transcript to Ava the same evening. Ava shared it with representatives of 12 species within the week, not as an accusation, as information. Here is what was said, here is what it means, here is what it suggests about the intentions of the party that said it. She added no commentary. She did not need to. The hardline faction discovered what had happened 9 days after the envoy's visit. Their intelligence officer came to the faction leader with the transcript and explained that it was currently in the possession of approximately 3,000 individuals across 19 species. The faction leader asked how. The intelligence officer said a Solhari trader had written it down and a human coordinator had distributed it. The faction leader asked why the Solhari trader had written it down. The intelligence officer said she appeared to have anticipated that documentation might be useful. The faction leader asked why the human coordinator had distributed it without any demand or negotiation attached. The intelligence officer said that was apparently just what the humans did. There was a long silence. The faction leader said, "Every time we apply pressure, they respond with information." The intelligence officer said yes, that appeared to be the pattern. The faction leader said, Pressure works by making the cost of resistance higher than the cost of compliance. What happens when the other party's response to pressure is to make the pressure visible to everyone watching. The intelligence officer said the effectiveness of the pressure dropped significantly. The faction leader thought about this. He said, "They are not fighting us." The intelligence officer said no. He said, "They are documenting us." The intelligence officer said that also appeared to be correct. The transcript had included, near the end of the envoy's statement, a line where the envoy had implied that species choosing to associate with humans might find themselves reclassified within the Keth trade framework. The implication was that reclassification meant worse terms, less access, more fees. It was the kind of veiled threat that the Keth had used for 3 centuries without anyone ever putting it in writing before. Now it was in writing, across 19 species, with Ava's name on the distribution. The Lethani, who had been in quiet renegotiation for several months, looked at the transcript and accelerated their timeline. The Risu, who had not yet formally engaged with the Keth at all, sent a message to the Human Coordination Network asking for an introduction. The hardline faction had applied pressure, and the result was 2 more species moving toward the humans. The faction leader called his key members together and told them they needed to change approach. He said soft methods had failed. He said documentation and information were weapons they could not easily counter because they required no supply lines and left no debris. He said the humans had spent 2 years building a web of relationships in this region, and the web was now large enough that pulling any thread tightened the whole thing. He said they needed to remove the center of the web. He said they needed to deal with the humans directly. None of the faction members asked what directly meant this time. They all understood. They went after the Ardent Step first because it was the most visible. Ava's ship had become something between a symbol and an institution in the region. It had been the first human vessel to make contact with the Solhari, the Gorathi, the Lethani. Its communication codes were in the databases of 40 species. When something happened that needed human attention, the Ardent Step was usually who people called. The hardline faction arranged for it to be seized. Not destroyed, seized. The plan was clean on paper. The Ardent Step would be pulled over at a Keth checkpoint on a routine inspection, held under a newly drafted administrative code that allowed detention of vessels engaged in what the code called unsanctioned economic interference. And Ava and her crew would be removed and placed in a comfortable but indefinite holding situation, while the Keth worked out what to do with the problem they represented. The checkpoint was staffed, the administrative code was filed, the Ardent Step arrived on schedule. The seizure took approximately 4 minutes. Ava and her crew did not resist. Bram asked, while being escorted off the ship, if he was permitted to bring his document case. He was told yes. He brought it. Petra said nothing. The Ardent Step was impounded in Bay 7 of the checkpoint station, and Ava's crew was placed in a secure suite that had functional water, reasonable food, and a window that looked out on the station's docking ring. The Keth hardline faction considered this a success. For about 6 hours. Then the messages started arriving. The first was from the Gorathi renegotiation team, asking for confirmation that the detention was real and requesting an explanation from the Keth Trade Council under the terms of the recently amended framework agreement, which included a clause, written by Bram, requiring either party to provide written justification for any action that materially affected the other party's ability to conduct normal operations. The second was from Liss, who had apparently been in communication with 12 other Solhari traders and was forwarding their collective formal inquiry about the status of the Ardent Step and its crew, citing the same clause. The third was from the Lethani, which was notable because the Lethani almost never sent messages. They sent one now. It was very short. It asked when Ava would be released. By the end of the first day, 47 separate formal inquiries had been lodged with the Keth Administrative Office from representatives of 21 species. Some were long and detailed, citing specific agreements and legal frameworks. Some were short. One was from a species the Keth had barely categorized yet, a small and recently contacted group called the Risu, and it said only, "We were told these people could be trusted. We are watching what happens to them." The Keth Administrative Office had never received 47 simultaneous formal inquiries about a single vessel seizure. The hardline faction had expected silence or diplomatic protest from the humans. They had not expected the rest of the galaxy to respond. Save was brought into the situation on the second day, which was when the hardline faction realized they had significantly miscalculated and needed the person who had been right before to help them understand why they were wrong again. She read through the inquiry file and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you understand what you have done?" The faction leader said they had removed the individual most responsible for disrupting Keth economic stability. Save said no. She said they had demonstrated to 47 parties simultaneously that the Keth were willing to detain someone for the act of helping other species understand their contracts. She said they had turned an abstract concern into a concrete event. She said that before the seizure, the worry among tributary species had been that the Keth might retaliate against those who renegotiated. Now those species had evidence. She said Bram had probably written a clause specifically for this situation. The faction leader said the administrative detention code was legally valid. Save said she was aware the code was legally valid. She said valid and wise were not the same thing, which was a lesson she had thought was understood after the Solhari transcript incident, but apparently required repeating. She asked if anyone had actually spoken to Ava since the detention. Nobody had. The faction had assumed isolation was strategically useful. Save went to the secure suite herself. She found Ava sitting at the table with Bram and Petra, eating a meal from the station's catering service. Bram's document case was open, and there were papers across the table. Petra was asleep on the couch with her jacket over her face. Ava looked up when Save came in and said hello, and asked if she wanted to sit down. Save sat down. She said she wanted to understand something. She said Ava had been detained without significant resistance, that her ship had been seized, and that she was currently being held in an administrative suite with no confirmed release date. She said she wanted to understand why Ava did not appear distressed by this. Ava said she was a little distressed, but that distress was not useful right now. Save asked what was useful right now. Ava said waiting. She said the faction had made a visible mistake, and the response to a visible mistake was to let it be visible. She said every message being sent to the Keth Administrative Office right now was being sent by species who were deciding something about the Keth based on how this situation resolved. She said if the Keth released her crew without condition, those species would take note of that. If the Keth held them indefinitely, those species would take note of that too. She said she trusted the species she had worked with to pay attention. She said she trusted that Save was here, because Save had already paid attention. Save looked at this person who had been detained by an imperial power, and was sitting at a table with papers and a sleeping colleague, and was explaining the political situation to the person detaining her. She said, "You planned for this." Ava said not exactly. She said you could not plan for every specific thing, but she said that when you spent 2 years helping people understand that they had rights, some of those people would remember that when it mattered. She said it was not a strategy. She said it was just what happened when you treated people like they were worth treating well. Save authorized the release that afternoon. She filed the administrative documentation herself, citing procedural errors in the detention code, which was not exactly true but was close enough to true that it would hold if anyone checked. The Ardent Step left Bay 7 the following morning. 47 formal inquiries were officially closed within the week. The hardline faction was considerably quieter after that. They had tried soft pressure and created a transcript. They had tried hard pressure and created a demonstration. They had spent 2 years applying the tools that had built the Keth Empire, and each application had made the humans' position stronger. The faction leader sat in his office on the last day of the month and looked at the updated report on human network expansion. The number of species in contact with human networks had grown again. It grew every month now. He thought about water finding its way through stone and decided he finally understood what that meant. 3 years after Bram walked into the public registry and simply read it, the Keth Empire held a session that had no official name on the calendar. It was not called a restructuring. It was not called a reform. The Keth legal tradition did not have good language for what they were doing, because what they were doing had no precedent in 300 years of expansion. The session was listed in the administrative schedule as an internal review of framework policy, which was the kind of title that meant something significant was happening, and no one wanted to say it plainly yet. 51 of the 61 tributary species had now either completed renegotiation or were in active process. The amended agreements were, in most cases, still economically favorable to the Keth. The empire was not collapsing. The wealth was still flowing. It was just flowing differently, with less of it being extracted and more of it staying in the places it was produced. And the Keth economists were finding, quietly and with some surprise, that tributary species with more economic stability were actually more productive partners than tributary species operating at the edge of what they could sustain. Bram had predicted this in a footnote in his original analysis. Save had found the footnote 3 months ago and reread it several times. She was in the session now, sitting at the long table with the full council, watching the last of the holdout faction members present their final argument for a return to original framework terms. The argument was not bad. It was economically coherent. It demonstrated with accurate numbers that the old system produced higher short-term returns. When the presentation ended, Save asked one question. She asked whether the old system, at its peak, had produced a situation where any member of any tributary species voluntarily, without coercion and without compensation, sent an inquiry expressing concern about the welfare of Keth personnel. The faction member said that was not a relevant metric. Save said she thought it was the most relevant metric available. She said the Keth had spent 3 centuries building a system that generated compliance. She said they had never, in that time, generated anything that looked like the 47 simultaneous inquiries from 21 species about 3 detained humans. She said the humans had been detained for 2 days, and the response had been faster and more coordinated than anything the Keth diplomatic corps had generated in a decade of deliberate relationship building. She said she wanted the council to sit with that comparison for a moment. The council sat with it. Outside the session chamber, the station continued its ordinary operations. Keth administrators processed paperwork. Traders from a dozen species moved through the docking bays. Somewhere in the eastern residential section, a group of Gorathi workers who had been assigned to a technical exchange program were eating lunch with their Keth counterparts and arguing about the best route through the outer trade lanes, which was a very ordinary argument that would have been impossible 3 years ago because Gorathi workers did not come to Keth stations for technical exchanges 3 years ago. Ava was not at the session. She had not been invited. The Keth had decided this was an internal matter, which it was. But 2 days before the session, Save had sent her a message. It was brief. It said, "We are going to do the thing you suggested. It will take time. Some of it will be done wrong and will need to be redone. I am telling you this because you will find out anyway, and I would rather you find out from me." Ava had written back the same day. Her response was also brief. It said, That is all anyone can do. Thank you for telling me. Save had read that response 4 times. She was still not entirely sure how to feel about a species that, when told a 300-year empire was going to try to become something better, responded with that is all anyone can do. The session voted, the restructuring passed. It was not unanimous. 3 members voted against and 1 abstained, but it passed. Save signed the documentation, and then sat alone in the chamber for a few minutes after everyone else had left. She thought about Petra, the quiet human woman who had placed a battered display on the table in a neutral room and shown her a list of names without asking for anything. She thought about Bram, who had walked up to a public registry and read it because it was available to read. She thought about Liz writing down a conversation she had anticipated would matter. She thought about what Ava had said in the detention suite, that you could not plan for every specific thing, that it was not a strategy, that it was just what happened when you treated people like they were worth treating well. Save had spent her whole career thinking about strategy. She was very good at it. She could see 5 moves ahead in most situations and 10 in the ones that mattered. She had not seen this coming. Not because it was clever, because it was simple, because it was so straightforward and so genuine that her entire framework for understanding what powerful actors did had no category for it. The Keth had looked at the humans and searched for the angle, the leverage, the long game, the hidden mechanism by which all this helping and sharing and information distributing would eventually convert into control. There was no mechanism. The humans were just doing it. A species that had evolved in violence, that had nearly destroyed itself twice, that carried the memory of every terrible thing it had ever done to itself and to others, had arrived in a galaxy organized around fear and debt, and had simply begun behaving as though a different organization was possible. And because they behaved as though it was possible, other species had begun to consider that it might be. And because enough species had begun to consider it, it had started to become true. Save picked up her things and left the chamber. In the docking bay, a Solhari trader named Liz was running a pre-departure check on her ship, which now had a new navigation module that a human engineer had helped her install last month, making her route significantly faster and safer. She was humming something. Save did not recognize the melody. She did not stop to find out what it was. She had work to do. But she made a note to ask Liz about it later. That was the kind of thing worth knowing. Outside in the dark between the stars, the ardent steppe was moving again. Same direction it always moved, toward whatever was next, toward whatever needed looking at. The galaxy had been ruled in fear for 300 years. It was going to take a while to become something else. But the thing about water and stone was not that the water was stronger. It was that the water never stopped.